Sorry about this.
No worries. So we are all here.
And you can hear me, huh? All good.
Yes.
Super. So welcome back. Pleasure to see you again. I realized, by the way, when going through the lectures which we are recording here in Zurich too, that some of the lectures, some of the portions of the lectures are actually good, other parts are not so good, and also a bit repetitive. So sorry for the imperfection, and I will try to not repeat myself so often. But this lecture is actually very different. This lecture is now the first of the later three and is much more about how we work. So you now know the thinking of deep urbanism, and then the question is always, so what do you do? And this lecture today is really practical work, let's say quote unquote conventional work. And the other two lectures are then more specifically addressing the issue of deep urbanism. One will be about digitalization, and the other one will be about politics, participation, and so on, narratives. And when we work, somehow two things I keep in mind. One, I told you about in the first lecture, which is this idea of systems ecology applied to architecture and urbanism, which has to do with an understanding of how systems change over time. We saw that already in the first lecture, that any kind of system, be it a natural system, be it a city, be it a company, tends to grow over time, become increasingly connected, then reaches a tipping point, disbands again, becomes reorganized in informal ways, so we have a lot of value but not so much connectedness, and then a kind of a new cycle starts again. For me, this is extremely helpful to think about work also in this almost ecological sense. Specifically, when you then imagine that these types of adaptive cycles actually are nested into each other, both in space and in time. So you have systems which oscillate very quickly, maybe in a daily cycle or in a yearly cycle, embedded in systems which oscillate slowly over hundreds of years, thousands of years. And you have systems on a local scale which are embedded in systems on increasingly larger scales. And they all affect each other. So for example, it is interesting to imagine that you have systems which are changed by other systems on a smaller scale and a smaller time frame, what is called here revolt. But revolt also could mean planning. It just simply means that you affect a system on a certain scale in space and time with a faster system. So you could argue it's an actual revolution, but you could also argue it's, for example, a project team working on a project, and with that fast and localized system affecting, for example, a part of a city, which is of course a slower and a bigger system, right? So it doesn't need to be a revolt in terms of revolution. It simply means smaller and faster scale affects a bigger and slower scale. And on the other hand, you have the idea of remembering things, where a larger and slower scale acts on a faster and smaller scale. Remembering, for example, a seed in the ground which generates a new tree after a bushfire eliminated the forest, or it is also monasteries remembering rituals, ideas, legal codes, and so on from the Roman Empire. but it might also be much easier things. It might be, for example, that a larger scale in a city, for example, infrastructure is affecting the faster and smaller scale also in the city. Then the other person which we met, which I find extremely interesting as a thought model, is Polanyi in terms of his idea of the great transformation. So the change from a local embedded culture to a more connected, but inevitably also more abstract culture at the moment when we invented market society. At the moment of scaling of industrialization. And here the term embedded is a kind of a key term for me. So that means I think all of what we do as architects is kind of spanning between the connected and the embedded. So connected means we are linked to larger scales, also to faster speeds maybe, and at the same time we need to make sure that we don't lose embeddedness, or you could also call it you need to make sure that local life and global access are working hand in hand rather than against each other. So when I talk about deep moves, what I mean is the idea to keep embeddedness as much as possible, so to keep the connection to the local, to the real, to the people in a particular place intact, with an idea of subsidiarity. So always try to solve on a local scale what you can and only go to a bigger scale when you have to. It also has to do with a realization of path dependency. So as soon as you build something, then it is built and a lot of options which you had before are gone. You know, every architectural wall also basically encloses space, but also prevents other enclosures of spaces. So again, the idea that we combine local life and global access. And this idea of subsidiarity you can understand in spatial terms, so that you are carefully connecting local environments to larger scales. For example, by embedding infrastructure so that it gives you access to larger scales, but at the same time doesn't destroy the smaller, more local scale. It also has to do with mobility, that you always generate accessibility to larger scales. It has to do with economy, that you generate opportunities, local opportunities. And it has to do with politics, that you allow for kind of local participation. And what this kind of means in daily practice, I'm going to tell you about in this lecture. So Switzerland, I already talked about it a bit, is of course this kind of hilly country in the center of Europe. This is not exactly the place where I spend my summer vacations, or did spend very much as a child, but it's very close to it. So it's this kind of rolling green hills which generate these valleys. And of course, on the other hand, we saw already Switzerland is also linked to the urban system in Europe. And you need to understand both of these factors in order to understand Switzerland. So the very local embeddedness in these rolling green hills, and the connectedness to a kind of a European urban system acting with and into each other. The connectedness to the urban culture is of course important because it gives you also access to European markets, European economy, European culture, and so on. And therefore, so from the very beginning, the question was how these towns and villages and farms can link themselves with infrastructures to these larger systems. so from energy to mobility and so on. And very early on, people started investing in and building these infrastructures, for example, railroads. This particular railroad originally being built by private money because local industrialists wanted to have access to the Gotthard line, so to the north-south axis through Europe. So you have these little houses and this infrastructure right next to it. And this is a kind of a first project I want to quickly show you, which is the railroad station of Herisau, where we have the current state shown here in this overview, and here the future state we want to turn this place into, with a kind of a new station area here in the front, but also an area development where by reorganizing the actual station square and the bus stop and so on, we also generate opportunities to add additional buildings and therefore additional urban development on the site. Now, when working on the project, it's kind of interesting to look back around 100 years ago or 110 years ago. This is what the location looked like. On the right-hand top, you have the town of Herisau. This line here is the original train line. And the original train line had an end station, a terminal station in Herisau, sort of linking Herisau to St. Gallen, the next larger city in the region. But as I said earlier, for the industrialists, mostly invested in textile industry, it was very important to have the link to European markets. So they therefore were interested in having a railroad station which was a through station, which continued further on. And for this, they basically had to lower this track, this single track, add tracks and link through this station over the bridge which we have seen before, through a couple of tunnels to the main axis through Europe. An achievement which they were, of course, incredibly proud of. So this is in 1910, the opening of this new station and of the tracks which now linked this town in eastern Switzerland to much bigger infrastructures and therefore much bigger markets. But now again, this infrastructure from 1910 has reached its limits, and bus stops have to be organized better. The disability access has to be organized better. The entire logistical regime in the station doesn't work so well anymore. So the task was very much to turn this very nice, slightly sleepy station into something new. You see here a bit how it is organized between this cliff, which has been generated by this earlier generation, digging down and laying the tracks on this lower level, flattening out the hill, and therefore ending kind of abruptly before the valley then goes further down. This was our competition model from 2014, so quite a long time ago, where we proposed this kind of scheme. Have now developed this scheme further with landscape architects, structural engineers, civil engineers, signaletics and lighting designers into this concept of a kind of a concrete wood hybrid construction, which allows us to make very large spans and generate this much more open, much more clear organization. still referring to this old cliff, but organizing it more cleanly so that all the bus stops are now working around this central island, which gives us access to the trains, but also access to the bus, and most importantly links between the two train lines. So this is the train line which spans which basically links the station to the larger system. This train line here is a more local train line. And here you see how this station now becomes reorganized, more clearly orientable and so on. And of course also generating a very strong sense of place with this very large roof. So the idea here is to connect, to basically improve again the connection the station has to larger infrastructure, but make very sure that while we are doing that, we are actually improving the local embeddedness, we are improving the local situation and the local quality for the people. So here the engineering portion of it, where we have this concrete wood hybrid structure with a kind of steel cable running here in top the entire length of this 110 meter long roof, in order to allow us this very big span of over 40 meters here in the center. The span had to be this big because there were so many bus stops, which of course have buses on them with doors where people exit and so on. So we needed to kind of absolutely minimize the columns. You see here a bit what this looks like. So also the idea of adding then lighting, skylights, so that the area underneath the roof is never dark, but always inviting and well lit. And then we are also linking the scale of the station, so from the north-south axis through Europe to the regional train system, to this regional bus stop, to a local site, linking then this local site to the village, so that people also really are able to use this station well, with a kind of a very filigrane bridge structure and a kind of a floating spiral staircase without any columns. The beauty of this is that the lower part of the staircase is actually a cantilever linked and embedded in the ground, then linking further up to this point here, which is actually a kind of a pin joint. So here you see the system. And this then is the result, a kind of a station linked both to the world but also to the town, thereby trying to bridge these different scales and at the same time still generating local quality. Then another project is this project here, which is a former metal factory which produced a lot of the Swiss classics, for example the famous Lundy chair, top middle, which does not produce anymore right now. So there are temporary uses now in these industrial halls. So where formerly you had people working, producing these metalworks, it's now a lot more sleepy. You have nature kind of growing in and industry almost completely receding, but still in terms of spaces being very iconic. And what we were tasked to do in this competition, which we won, was basically to turn this place into 20% still of production and commercial uses and 80% of housing, and do that again in a way where we work with and expand on the established identity, which has a kind of a town part which which comes from the industrial site, you know, orthogonally organized, a bit more hard, and also able to incorporate production and commercial functions. So this portion here, and another part which is kind of embedded into this green, more Arcadian portion of the existing situation. So thereby combining the original industrial hall, of which we keep a part, with new areas for retail, commerce and production, and put housing on top around this small square, with a high porosity also from the public street. Again here, the historic hall, which we keep and use for cultural events, for a bit of production still, but also pop-up stores, and the middle part as a kind of a winter garden or as a kind of a foyer for the entire site. And we link that to this green Arcadian park landscape, in which then the other housing parts are located. So also again here, very much working with the history of the site, trying to extend it, both functionally as well as identity-wise. So never work with tabula rasa, but always keep the historic depth of the site, right? So the first project was about infrastructural depth. This project was now about identity and historical depth. The same kind of historical depth we were trying to keep also in this competition, which we didn't win. Herzog Dömerow won it with a project which I don't like so much, but that's the life of an architect. You often lose. But this is originally a kind of a customs terminal in Basel, a logistics center rather. And the question here was basically to link this logistics center in the south here, which is changing rapidly, becoming more and more mixed use. There's a very nice project by BIG, so by Bjarke Ingels, further to the south, to link this part with this more traditional fabric of the city to the west here, left-hand side of the image. There's also a very nice historic cemetery located to the east of our site. You see here also this kind of city grid on the left, and this kind of railroad track logic to the side, to the south, which we had to link together. What we try to do is basically have here this kind of big retail structure which we needed to keep and add to, and embed that into this local condition better, add functions on top of it. And now here we have this kind of transition element, the kind of perimeter block structure which we take from the existing historic portion and work with it in a way where we still generate all of these niches, but we add more volume to these niches with these high rises, which you will see in a second. And I think what you will see again and again in the projects which we do is this attempt of nesting spaces from the big idea of this larger kind of neighborhood to the public square which you see here next to this retail space, to these perimeter blocks with their courtyards, to then the loggias of the people living here and so on, right? It's always the idea of nesting. So again, you see this here, you have the street grid from the historic part coming out, generating here these public space, tree covered and very green. And here these smaller perimeter blocks with the green courtyards. Around the green courtyards we have in the front also commercial functions, in the back however housing, oriented always towards the green, towards the inside, because the street in the back is actually quite noisy. And then we add mass to this perimeter block to fulfill the requirements of the FAR, floor area ratio, which the client wanted from us. So again, here you see this fractal organization of big idea, medium scale idea, small scale idea, all of them linked and nested together. So that they're always meaningful, the socially, let's say the uses and the different functions in terms of social spaces are always organized well. There's always, for example, a threshold from the public space to the more local space, and a threshold then from this communal space to the individual space, for example by this green, then covering and protecting the housing behind it. So here again you see this kind of fractal organization, this kind of nesting of scales into each other. Or here in our model. And then this is then the effect that now we are behind this first row of buildings. We are looking here along this inner axis. So on the right hand side we have the interface between this collective space inside the perimeter block, and then on the other side the public space. And on the left we have then the living areas protected by the green courtyards and by the balcony zone in the plinth area of the buildings. This then is the public space. Again, you have the commercial facade on the left, you have a pavilion in the middle, you have the larger retail side on the right, and again this slab tower as a kind of an marker for the entire area. And then here again we are further out in the system, so this is this larger regional road, again with a tram, a louder, and this road then has addresses which are more regional addresses. On the one hand the big high-rise with a office plinth and a housing top, and here the addresses of this large retail company. Also again this kind of nesting of spaces, addresses on a regional, on a neighborhood, and on a local scale. Same idea here, a competition where we won a portion of, but unfortunately not the master plan. But again here you see this nesting of scales in a project in Bern, where the task was to add here a new neighborhood and a new park. And the idea we developed was basically to bring this public road, of course, on the one hand along the site, but on the other hand also into the site. So here it would become pedestrian. The reason why we have this gap here is because there's a large tunnel underneath, so we cannot build anything here. And along this pedestrian line you have on the lower part the perimeter block with the courtyards, and on the upper part a more porous structure which then allows you then to link to this public park. And on the other side of the public park you have then these allotment gardens. Again, nesting of spaces, of addresses, of users, so that adding mass always also means adding quality, adding opportunity, adding niches and spaces which actually are worth using. And then again, zooming in more, so what you see here is basically this portion we took out and developed a bit more for one or two cooperatives. So this is cooperative housing. The idea of this housing is that we have fairly efficient volumes. For example, this point building here. The idea of this volume is that the staircase is actually outside, is cold, and through this staircase, which of course also has an elevator here, via these, in German it's called Laubengänge, probably in English you call them galleries, we access all of the apartments of this building and also some of the apartments of this building. So everything is linked by these collective spaces. All of them are organized around this collective garden space, and that then again sits at this pedestrian alley which you have seen before in the master plan and is connected to the collective green, which is more public towards the upper part here. And this then, the idea what it could look like finally. Right, so again, a nesting of scales and users and functions from the neighborhood alley to a pocket square or park to a communal staircase where you have functions embedded in it. From that staircase you go to the galleries, and from the galleries you go into your private house. And on the left-hand side again a garden which is in parts shared. Now, so this is the general strategy. So always this nesting of spaces, functions and users. And I'm showing you now two larger projects where you can see that you can also do that in entire quarters, not only in area developments. Both of these projects are first prizes which we won in Hamburg. First the Hafen City, and then the Elbinsel quarter here in Wilhelmsburg. Both are located in the estuary of the Elbe River. So this is one river, the Elbe River, which kind of flows around this very large island which is located to the south of the city of Hamburg, which you find here. And this is basically again a story of a city which is linked here, Hamburg, which is linked into this European urban system. A city which in the mid-19th century was still largely walled, but had already quite a performative, well-functioning harbor organized here still in this smaller portion within the city wall, but slowly growing beyond. Then here in 1913 you see how the harbor jumped out, how the connectivity to the world became increasingly important, and of course the harbor was very much the reason for the success and wealth of Hamburg, so it was important to scale it up. They did this by leaving the city walls and going into the Elbe River. So you see here the beginning of the 20th century what that looked like. And at that time, all of what you see here in the middle of the image was basically a forbidden city outside of the German custom boundary. And this portion here was a very large logistics area and storage area. So all of these buildings here are storage buildings, storing goods which came in from overseas. And you have here, of course, again, the links which are required, for example, railroad links which are required to operate this big harbor. And then it became clear at the end of the 20th century that the harbor again needed to be bigger, because in the current harbor organization you could not organize the big container shipping which was necessary to be competitive in an increasingly growing global economy. And at that moment, at the end of the 20th century, in a kind of a fairly secretive operation, the city of Hamburg started planning for this future where the docklands would become available for urban development. They very cleverly bought pieces of land not yet owned by the city, and you have to understand that the city of Hamburg is at the same time also a province, a Bundesland, so they have quite some political power. But they started buying this land, and Volkwin Mark, so from Gerkan Mark partner, made the very first sketches of what this city could look like. They then made workshops where a lot of international architects were participating, and finally also competition which was won by KCAP, by Astok and ASP architects in Germany. Astok and ASP are Germans, KCAP was Dutch at that time. And with that, of course, then this transformation which is now globally known as the Hafen City Hamburg started. You see here the current model with this Elbphilharmonie by Herzog de Meuron in the front. Our area which we won in 2015 here at the very end, so the other side of the development. So this is the Hafen, the Elbphilharmonie. And what is amazing is that in a very short period of time, this vision could become reality. So you have here the Hafen City 1997, still almost entirely logistical. Then here, slowly, you have the first developments along the Kaiserkai. So these were the very first buildings. So this building here later became the plinth of the Elbphilharmonie. Today, this new part of the city of Hamburg is actually frequented very well. It's quite well done. You have people, you have users. And they did a couple of things incredibly cleverly. For example, very early on, they built the metro system. So what you see here is actually a metro station. So the site today looks very different. And the development tool and company which basically was running the whole thing was the Hafen City GmbH. And this is specifically the Hafen City GmbH is a special purpose vehicle, so it's a company which, however, is fully owned by the city of Hamburg. And that company was able to develop, almost like a private developer, this entire site in a way where they were able to spend money on infrastructure early on, and were then able, step by step, to amortize this very early capital expense, and specifically also step by step turn this whole thing into a business case in which the city then did not lose any money. So in the end, this whole development basically paid for itself, which is quite an achievement. And what you may know is that in a lot of specifically Eastern European countries, This doesn't work so smoothly, so what you have there is that either the EU or the public hand actually loses quite a bit of money with these developments, whereas the private developers usually make money. But the genius of the Hafen City project and of the Hafen City GmbH very specifically was that they could do this in the end all together with a functioning business case. And this again went very fast, so 2030 should see the completion of this entire project. So within 30 years they turned these abandoned docklands of more than 150 hectares of land into a kind of a well-functioning urban development, which will have around 15,000 residents in the end, and a total investment of 13 billion euros, of which 3 are public, for example the subway, and around 10 in the end will be private. So we visited this site first in this international competition in 2015. So this is us and a lot of competitors basically walking through the eastern part of the Hafen City. At that time, a kind of a wasteland, but a wasteland where the roads were already planned and partly built. So what you see here is the level of the future roads, which were more or less given. And the large empty area will be the future basements. And the roads were built so early so that the build-up could sink over several years to the level which the roads finally need. So the whole thing is settling down over many years and compacting itself, so that when you then finally build the roads, they don't move anymore. And of course, at the same time, you don't need to excavate basements when you are already at the right level. And in turn, the roads had to be at this level 8 meter, 45 centimeters above average river level, in order to be protected against high waters, against flooding, right? Flooding specifically also by the ocean pushing water back into the river. This is then our winning proposal. And again here you see this nesting, right? So you have the large figure of the harbor basin, you have the public square, you have roads, you have smaller squares, you have courtyards, all organized so that both harbor noise and wind don't so that they're not too problematic. At the same time that the sun really is able to enter these courtyards. And of course, infrastructurally, the entire neighborhood is linked well to the U-Bahn system, here with a station which is above ground. And this is then the kind of the final result, also with the landscape competition winner now embedded. It's organized around these plinths, a lot of which have commercial functions in it, so that this really becomes an active part of the city, where people also really want to be, spend time in restaurants, in shops, or with cultural activities. There are also 2 hotels planned. Above that you have housing in red, office space in grey, and hotels and commercial functions in blue. And for us it was very important to structure the space with these gates. therefore we also called this our scheme the Elb gates, so to speak. You know, where always you move from one scale to the next scale, so from one scale to the next scale, and therefore our nested system becomes readable. At the same time, it was also important that we link these scales. So for example, what you see here very faintly is a passage which links the courtyards internally. So the idea would be, for example, that if a kid lives here in this courtyard, it can walk through here through a bit of public space and visit a friend who might live in the next courtyard. Right? So this nestedness has to do with generating thresholds, but it also has to do with generating links between these individual compartments, so to speak. And that generates us hierarchies of spaces. So from the orange, very public, to the increasingly more local space hierarchy, to in green, even more local, neighborhood level, or then here the courtyard level, which is then really increasingly privatized. Or here in a very early urban design rendering, maybe looking like this, versus a slightly more accessible scale looking like this. And then here, the larger scale of the Amerigo Vespucci Square looking out into the harbor basin. Or the view back where you see the wharfed fronts. So again, there might be moments when this level is flooded. The safe level is actually up here, 8.45 meters. And the Amerigo Vespucci Square is gradually flooded because it's an inclined plane. And the other thing which was important for us was this almost scenographic organization, you know, like you have in a scenery, in a theater, where back here you have the deep part of the stage, and then you have these buildings kind of forming a kind of a series of receding planes, so to speak. And at the very end you have the Elb Tower, which is currently being worked on by Chipperfield, which at some point might look like this. So basically, this is a 600 million euro project, and is of course the last bit of land sale the city of Hamburg needed in order to pay for the city and its infrastructure, which you see in the front of it. I was in the jury of this competition, which was super interesting because it was a competition where basically the investor was competing, and the investor had then had an architect and other planners as his in his team. But there are also other competitions have been decided now. So this is done by Günther Henn, a highly digitalized building, or this is a kind of concrete wood hybrid building, which is this hotel on the western part, so at the end of our site. And also here the station by Gerkan Mark partner almost by now actually finished. So this is a kind of a project on a tabula rasa, you know, where we could really invent everything anew. I mean, the street system in parts was already given, as you have seen, but other than that, we could really create the city from scratch. And towards the south in Wilhelmsburg, on this Elb Island, which you have seen before, the task was actually extremely different. So here, the site we are working on is actually this entire portion here at the very center of the image. And the site became accessible because this highway, which you see here in the image center, is being moved to the edge of the railroad tracks. And that means this core here can be completely redeveloped. The Elbe Island has been flooded in 1962, so urban development actually wasn't so fast because everybody was a bit hesitant about investing in this part of Hamburg. But other parts are actually quite nice, have a fairly colorful, highly mixed, also demographically mixed urban life already. It has landscape parts which are actually fairly beautiful because over time the harbor infrastructure has been grown over with greens and trees and so on. It's a place also where allotment gardens allowed a lot of people intimate, fairly happy lives already. So we had to really take care that we could embed ourselves in this existing situation. So what we came up with is basically, again, a kind of a nested system between two canals, which of course were existing, where we are compressing the allotment gardens somewhat, but we need to keep them, where you still see the line of this old highway, almost like the memory of a Roman road embedded in this neighborhood. And around that, with one new road which we are adding, we are generating now the opportunity of these new, highly differentiated urban blocks, from fairly porous to a bit more intimate, always with these water lines kind of making sure there is drainage on the one hand, but also making sure that there is identity, where the green is really linking together with the urban into something like this, where also the idea was very important that, as we have seen in the existing historic part of Wilhelmsburg, also here we try to generate small units. So these big blocks we now defined as law have to be developed with a small grain, a grain which is organized around individual staircases, so to speak, so that always the unit of a house is still readable. So what we want to prevent is that in these areas that a large developer could just develop this entire block and make everything the same, however well done. We really want to keep here the grain of an individual family's building, for example, like here in these more local addresses, or at least the grain of one house where the people in a staircase, sharing a staircase, still know each other. And that's then the effect, that there is quite a bit of diversity around one of these so-called Wettern, so these drainage ditches, always organized again with threshold making, which is fairly precise, so that you can really live also on the ground floor, and a kind of a public green which is accessible to all. Here the view in the other direction. And here, by the way, as a quick aside, we're also building a rowing club, which is great fun. So this is a project of ours, which we are currently working on. A project which is, of course, not anymore now in a fairly hidden, intimate green area, but will be surrounded by quite a bit of public and the pressure of a lot of people. So what we're doing is we are making a building which can be completely enclosed. So if it's not used, all of these sliding doors can be pulled together like a turtle, so that the rowing club at times can be quite protected, let's say. For example, when you have a big event. This is the interior space with folding doors. And then this is the boathouse looking out into the canal. And I show you a lot of projects to show you similarities in the project following this larger idea of nesting spaces, the larger idea of subsidiarity, and a careful organization of scales, right? So it's not so important. So each project on its own is not the point. The point is the projects together. That's why I'm showing you a lot of them. This next project is a competition which we didn't win in Hamburg, which is located in one of the more established neighborhoods, which is characterized by very beautiful public parks, but also these traditional facades, again with a kind of a pre-zone, also here kind of carefully done. It's the site of Beiersdorf, which is the company which produces, for example, Nivea, the Nivea cream. They now have a new location and they wanted to develop this site completely new. We were not allowed to keep buildings in this particular case. We actually proposed that, but they didn't want that. And here we had the task of generating a kind of a large block, which however allows a lot of porosity in the neighborhood, so that what before was kind of enclosed and inaccessible now becomes accessible. Also here we had to add quite a bit of mass in order to make the business case function. So we added high rises, but we we proposed the high rises in the middle of the site, so that from the outside you have a transition from this public park, which we have seen before, to a kind of a square, then a couple of steps up to an inner alley, which is however still quite public. At this inner alley we have the plinths of these high rises which have public functions, and then on top of these plinths we have housing functions. Again, this kind of nesting of functions, people, spaces and addresses. Or also here, this kind of inner road, which is less accessible. So what you see here is this road here, with a kind of a kindergarten in this part. So kindergarten kind of here, with a garden, kind of an outdoor garden on the roof. Again, that there is, in spite of the large mass we are adding, there is still porosity, connectivity, and at the same time a sense of neighborhood developing. Again, a similar project here in Germany, in Freiburg, a large greenfield development where we had to deal with rivers, where we worked with the idea of very large blocks, which you see here with my mouse showing it, with a kind of a moment where public uses intensify around a new core, where we are adding this kind of green ring, which is car-free, where you basically move by bike. And in that we are weaving a road network for cars, and are adding a tram line here in the center, which gives you access to a kind of a more pedestrian center. So here you see this overlay of systems, you know, the big blocks, the small blocks, the green ring going around, the tram coming in, accessing it where there are not so many cars, and here the access from the highway with the road system, and all of that not crossing so blatantly, right? So that basically the heavy traffic and pedestrians never, they cross, but they never coincide, right? For example, the green ring actually has absolutely no car traffic in it, and so on. And that then being the result. So also here a kind of a weaving together of green and city, of infrastructural scale with the tram and the local scale of the green ring, and adding the car in a way that it doesn't destroy this local system which we are building. Again, a similar project in Münster. Münster is interesting because it has this house logic already built into the historic fabric. Here we were working in the garden of a monastery, which is extremely beautiful. So the idea was to keep all of these trees and to keep all of these green structures and existing buildings and embed them into a new kind of block structure. Again, same thing, nesting of people, users, spaces and addresses. Same idea here in Otterbach near Basel, a project which we won, where again you have a similar idea of scaling, which then allows us to really weave together the green and the city, and most importantly allow you to live basically in the forest almost, right? And finally, or second finally, a kind of a project which is very different, but I show you because we really like it. This is a competition which we submit in a few days actually. I will present it on Monday. It's an extremely beautiful site at the Lake of Lucerne, where again we're trying to embed ourselves into a lower part along the lake road and a slightly higher sequence of buildings along these more local roads with plans. And again, in these plans, again you see this nesting, right? The nesting of the more, so now looking at one apartment, of the more public spaces of kitchen, dining and living with a view out. And here the sleeping area, which has a threshold, a corridor, bathrooms, so that the more private portion in an apartment is organized a bit separately from the more public functions in an apartment, which is accessible here by this elevator directly or by a staircase via this threshold again. So my point being, even on the level of an apartment, we are working with the same ideas, right? Nesting, threshold, and organizing of spaces, people, and functions in a kind of a fractal manner. So here these buildings on the site as silhouettes, differentiated here also by a kind of a building which is one large object, but at the same time we are differentiating it in section slightly to break the scale, and we most importantly differentiate it also in terms of facade making, so that we break the scale of this large object and are able to kind of hide it in the landscape. Here the more cost-effective rental apartments. So these are apartments you buy, these are apartments you rent. And then again, through this private houses, where basically all the outdoor spaces of the houses are always in the building volume, right? There are no gardens. We are not occupying the park level with private functions. So there are no sun umbrellas, hedges, you know, this entire trash of suburban life. We don't have that. So people are in the volume, like living in this rock, because the idea is these are like rocks being left by some glacier on this green hill. So people are living here. And for the public, so for the village public, we are generating connections by having this park landscape going through from the hill to the lake, with this path connecting everything together, giving people access from this existing boathouse, historic boathouse at the lake, to a communal part organized around this barn, to looking out from your house, to a kind of a public lookout spot which gives you access to the hill view, or a more intimate resting spot, also giving access to this park and the hill view. Right, it's the weaving together of a private occupation of the land with these apartments which are bought by people, but these people, they don't live on the park, they live next to the park, and the park is given to the public. In the end, then generating an idea like this. And even in the center of Zurich, in a fairly in a location right here, the same idea again, you know, the idea of generating a clear facade to the public streets, which is a bit unusual, but it's still well behaved. You know, so basically these pieces here, these volumes are, due to the Zurich building law, we can only 20% of the facade, sorry, 1/3 of the facade can actually protrude. No, sorry, 20% of the facade can protrude. Here we have the main intersection where we are high, and we are stepping down and we are attaching ourselves to the local scale. And then the other side is participating in the courtyard of this perimeter block, where all of these staircases and so on give you an additional access to your apartment. So you can exit your apartment on the one hand by an elevator, which is hidden in here, and a staircase. But you can also always use the external staircase, which again links everybody. So also here, linking the public and the private in a way that a kind of a collective added value is being generated. But embedding is not only something you do with buildings, you embed projects also with processes. And this is the last project I'm going to show you. Embedding with processes, we did here with a participatory process quite extremely in this location, which is at the very center of Zurich. So this is the main station in Zurich. This is the rail yard, kind of, where which is historic. So you see here the same site in 1920. So this is this really prominent viaduct. This is the old station of Zurich. Our site is here. Currently, it's still used to as a mechanical workshop to work on maintaining wagons and rail and locomotives. There are historic protection issues. So, for example, we need to keep this building here. We need to keep part of this building here. So here you see how it's used today. We also need to keep this building, which basically generates the main address to the neighborhood. And this neighborhood is very well used because it's extremely central. It has a very beautiful park right next to our site, the so-called Josef-Wiese, the Josef Meadow. And it's a site which is very politically charged because the people who live here, they have a very good neighborhood life. They also fought for this life. So this square here in the 1980s was actually planned to be a highway access to the city of Zurich. So people revolted against, they organized against it, and now they have this actually very beautiful square which is frequently used, for example for summer festivals. So you couldn't just do a plan and then think it can be implemented easily. We had to do some participation for two reasons. On the one hand, to politically legitimate the development, but on the other hand also to hear what the people have to say, to prevent the kind of a top-down modernist way of planning, but make something which is embedded not only in terms of built volumes, addresses and spaces as we have been seen before, but it's embedded also in the minds of the people through their ideas and through their participation. In order to do this, we built a kind of a model building kit, a kind of a Lego set for an urban workshop. So what you see here in this kind of pink are plinth modules used as ground floors. These things here are building blocks for housing. We have trees, we have cars, we have people. Every group which was coming to participate got one site model which we prepared in the office, which was actually a gigantic amount of work, was a bit insane to do. These models we then discussed and had workshops on with large groups of people. We did this for one day with 4 groups for 2 days total. So we had a total of 8 groups organized in 2 days who had model parts. They had a board where they could collect ideas. They had mood postcards from us to express ideas more effectively. And we then started to produce typologies with them. Of course, everybody wanted to make green high-rises, but it was kind of fun. These first type ideas we then placed together into ensembles, into groups of buildings, which we made really beautiful. And even the urban planner of Zurich was very happy to photograph it. And we then placed it together. So this is all work of one day with a group of amateurs, so to speak. Brutally just telling them, look, you have one day to produce an idea, and they all succeeded. And it was interesting to see what people had in their mind. So this is the idea of a Riviera along the railroad tracks, a public promenade with slightly raised, with water, with green. And then you have an alley system, and in this alley system you might even have high-rises. So people are not afraid of height, they're not afraid of density, but people are afraid of anonymity and ghettoization and a certain urban brutality. And of course they're right to be afraid of that, they're right to not want that. So this is the second team where we had high-rises with waterfalls, where we had an embedding also of the existing historic quarters, where we had a very large building. We had an idea of fairly well-organized urban blocks. So one here, a second one, very large one here, incorporating also the existing buildings. We had the idea of really embedding buildings also in the existing halls. We then took all of these ideas, this is me drawing, and we turned that into a catalog. So we produced a lot of types, a kind of a pattern language of building typologies invented by the people. We then discussed it with them. This is the mayor of Zurich, gracing us with her presence, discussing the project as a whole. And from all of that, we then distilled a kind of an ideal solution, trying to keep as many ideas from the participation intact. So you see here the stacking of functions, the green roofs. You see keeping the existing hall, adding a kind of a differentiated high-rise to that hall, so the hall becomes a kind of a foyer. The existing hall becomes a foyer for the new high-rise. We have the very green courtyard, again a kind of a nesting of spaces now not invented by us, by the people. We have the historic train lines still visible in the public space as traces and memories. We then turned this into preliminary building law. This is a kind of a master plan where we have fairly abstract building sites, and here what we call situations. So for example, the situation at the tracks, right? It's kind of a building law with a narrative component, trying to keep the ideas and the narratives of the people intact, and in the end, ending up with a kind of illustration of these situations which we invented together as a kind of a memory which is then embedded in the final urban design, which of course still needs to be planned. So the message here is that embedding also means embedding it into these active agents of urban change, which we of course have gotten to know in the lecture Deep Cognition, right? Everybody of these, every single person is an embodied mind with a past and a future. And of course what we need to do is to keep this organicness, to keep this ability to carry something from the past into the future, to keep this intact while we plan. So embedding is not only in time, lecture 1, it is not only in space, lecture 2, but it is also very much in this collective, emerging, co-evolving, embodied mind which we are all sharing. So this is the first of the 3 applied lectures, and I hope it made sense. And I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Markus. So guys, does anyone have a kind of immediate question or comment?
I wanted to say thank you because these are very beautiful projects and it's very interesting to look at them.
Thank you.
And second, I was like wondering when you were saying about the fact that people are not afraid of the high-rise buildings and the density and but they are afraid of, as you said, of ghettoization, right, and other things. And I was thinking immediately that probably the fear is the sign of becoming unknown or the correlation of the past situations that turned out to be bad. I guess that's what our psyche is used to do with the fear, because the fear is the sign of something. And then if you give people the narratives that they are able to process, then the fear goes away, and of course they can like happily accept the project. So probably that was like an interesting thought that popped up in my mind when you were speaking about that.
And it's exactly correct, because what we have seen is that the entire history of urbanization is a history of scaling. And scaling meant that we had, on the one hand, access to ever larger scales, But on the other hand, we also lost our roots, right? And so what we now need to ensure is that this access to the global scale, which we all enjoy, is not bought by the brutality of modernity, where everybody is put into an anonymous high-rise sitting on an anonymous urban ground, but everybody is located in a location he or she understands, is part of, has access to, is involved to some degree in governing. And at the same time, that local scale does not mean you're locked into a village, but you still are able to access the larger scales. Again, infrastructurally, politically, economically, and so on. So that's the aim, that's the goal, right? And you're completely correct. The most important thing is that the narratives of the people who are living here are kept intact, or are at least enabled to a degree that people feel at home. You know, I think that's an absolutely key issue. So scale is good, yes, we all profit from it, but when scale forces us into anonymity, then it becomes problematic, because then we need to react with formal means of control. And that brutality we have seen, of course, a couple of times now in my lectures, and that in the end usually tends to go wrong. So the question is perfect, I totally agree.
Thank you for your answer.
And I also have one comment which is basically related with the question of Danila. And I think, like, if we look at this project from a professional point of view, we will see, like, throughout the history, right, the very essence of the project itself changing a little bit, at least, like, what I see here in Russia and what I know from other countries and from my practical activities in other countries. So basically, project right now is not only the element, like not only the tool of a design, but it's also a kind of a tool of negotiation and storytelling. So providing people like what they need, stories, and also like involving all of the stakeholders and kind of so design sometimes. Of course it matters, but sometimes it's kind of a secondary thing. But the first thing, you need to show the idea, you need to negotiate it, and you need to move this project on. So thank you so much for bringing this.
Yeah, or I would say it's a kind of a hand in hand. You know, it's you need to keep both. You need to propose a project, but you also need to allow people to enter the narrative of the project. And you know, it was interesting. I recently gave a virtual lecture in Kazakhstan for the Urban Forum Kazakhstan, and the issue they have, of course, is in the south of the country they have some historic cities, but all of the northern part is basically Soviet cities built specifically for industry and for resource extraction. And all of them are organized in these Soviet microrayon structures. They're not that bad, right? Microrayon is also a form of nesting, right? So it's an urban quarter. You have the slab buildings. You have the kind of the public storefront towards the street and so on. So microrayons are not wrong. But of course they're very hard, they're very, they can be very generic and very repetitive, and they can have a lack of hierarchy. And so one of the big questions in Kazakhstan would be, how can you take this type of urban fabric and turn it into something which is again relocalizing people? Because the big problem of the microrayons today is that after privatization, they are actually more anonymous than they were before. Right before, when nobody locked his or her door, the microrayons were kind of a cool place to play as a kid, you know, because you could just run to the staircases and visit everybody and so on. But now with this double and triple and quadruple locks, it's a very different environment. You know, the fall of the Iron Curtain brought the locking of the door of your apartment, right? It was really so. One lock came down, the other locks went up. You know, so and so I think you know, so this will be a very interesting story to kind of go through and think through.
May I just say some comments about your project in Hamburg? I found it very interesting about how you use hierarchy level. It was something like hierarchy Stufe.
Mm-hmm.
But you use this word in absolutely different meaning. That it's something like horizontal hierarchy, not a high hierarchy.
It's a good question. I mean, most of the hierarchy I have shown is in plan, so horizontal, yes, correct. Because you know, cities are primarily organized horizontally because we move horizontally as people. We understand horizontal relationships more easily than vertical relationships because we are not birds, right? So, and in this horizontal plane, the aim is to generate spaces which bring me from my apartment door, which I understand and control, to increasingly more public moments in a way where I have a sense of safety along the way. You know, the most brutal way of living is when your apartment door immediately enters a completely uncontrollable public space. Then social relationships don't build because everybody is an anonymous number in these large apartment blocks. But as soon as you start nesting, then relationships can develop over time. And the more horizontal you organize relationships, the better this nesting and the better this growth of, or the better this avoidance of anonymity can work. Because one of the relationship killers, of course, are also elevators, right? So elevators are anonymity generators. So that's why also it is better. It is easier to organize communities in low rise. I mean, low rise means up to 6 floors or so, right? And if you build high rises, what we're trying to do here in our project in Neugasse is that you break a high rise into portions and you give public squares in between high rise levels. You know, again, so then the hierarchy becomes verticalized also, but that's much harder to do and a little bit more hypothetical.
So maybe I have just a quick question. This concept of nesting comes from this concept of panarchy, right?
I mean, you know, it's the same idea. It doesn't come from it. I just, you know, of course, this nesting, when you are an architect and you think about space, automatically you start thinking about groups around, about thresholds, about relationships and so on, right? And however, what I then realized is that this idea from systems ecology to this panarchy, these adaptive cycles, and the more broader idea of panarchy is basically a parallel concept, right? And in many ways this makes total sense because you know, anything is organized around localities because we are, again, I mean, you know, we are embodied minds. We live on a planet which has gravity, so moving takes time and is energy intensive. So we tend to organize our lives in local ways, naturally, right? Completely naturally. And that means also ecosystems are organized in a nested way. Obviously, it makes sense, right? And so in the end, there is a common cause to both. But I didn't start working urbanistically in a nested way because I read that book, let's put it like that. But I think intellectually they are analog ideas and analogous ideas. And again, you know, when you go back to Polanyi, the point of great transformation, the loss of embeddedness, in the scaling up of modernity, then of course what we now need to do is re-embedding. You know, we need to make sure that we strengthen the local, because the local is our best insurance against disruptions. You know, if we can make sure that local units function, it's basically a guerrilla strategy also. You know, if we can make sure that local units function, then some loss of connectedness is not a problem. And this is a fairly abstract idea, but you can think about it in very real terms. You know, if you have local gardens, if you have local communities, then local urban production places, then again, some degree of loss of connectedness is not such a problem, right? So it has this philosophical, even science fiction type of component in the very background. You know, and the beauty is when you look at cities which function, for example, Tokyo is an extremely amazing city and an amazing experience to be there, because Tokyo is of course a hyper-metropolitan place with extremely powerful infrastructures, and nevertheless you might move 2 streets away from super central places and you are in a local neighborhood, right? So Tokyo is a metropolis built of villages, and that's why it's such a well-functioning place and such a pleasure to be in. You have other metropolis, you know, London is similar, for example. You have other metropolis like Houston or like other places where these local relationships don't function, and then you have this problem of anonymity. And as soon as you have anonymity, people feel unsafe. As soon as they feel unsafe, they don't go out the door, and then cities start to be empty and lifeless. Moscow has portions which are extremely village-like, and it also has, and which still function quite well, but it has also portions which are incredibly brutally made and therefore highly dysfunctional. You know.
How do you prevent that? Because you know, there are some like a lot of situations where the developer is only thinking about maximizing the utility of the business, and they don't have this vision to make it functional, to make it embedded to the community. Yeah,
I mean, there are 3 answers. This is one of the key questions, right? There are 3 answers. One is bottom-up desire, so you make sure that people have a say, or as a community you mobilize. The second idea is that as a state you require the developer to do certain things, so you force him by good zoning laws. But that needs a strong state, which is not always the case. The first one needs strong communities, which is not always the case. And as an architect working with a developer, you should also argue for utility in a broader sense, or for value in a broader sense. You know, because in the end, the resource of an urban development is the demands of the users. That's what you're working with, right? The better you incorporate the demand of the user rather than an abstract quantitative demand, you incorporate qualitative demands. The better you do that, the better your thing will function and the more resilient it will be in the future. It's just a well done urban development, right? And so the aim is to convince the developer to put mid and long term value and gain above short term gain. And there, the biggest problem is, of course, that the development process currently, which is developers producing floor areas and volume for investors, so that they sell it too quickly, right? And the investor oftentimes is institutional money who is completely uninterested in long-term value because they don't think. But the danger of this short-term way of thinking is of course, the sudden loss of value or the threat of a sudden loss of value because people just don't like it. They just don't want to live there because it sucks. So the threat of sucking is probably the best answer I can give you.
Thank you very much.
But again, I think, in order to, the short-term brutality of capital without brain is one of the biggest threats in everything we are facing right now. This is the issue, right? So it's not the capitalists, again, as I tried to show you in the Marx lecture. It's the problem is the system which forces people to lose their brain, to think in terms of short-term gain. And there, as an architect, you need to have the narrative and the intellectual toolbox in order to convince developers both of their personal individual humanity, they're also people, and secondly, you need to convince them of the long-term value of something which is resilient and stable because it is well built, well structured, and not so easily, fragmenting. But this is hard to do, and we also have been fired because we tried to do that. So that's just life. But I think as long as you're able to see the goal, then you try to argue always towards that goal. I think that's the aim, right? I see a Nur al-Rotib. I'm sure you have a question. I'm hopelessly mispronouncing the name, sorry.
No, it's okay. Actually, I don't have a question, but I'd like to thank you for your inspiring lectures. I'm an architect, and actually there has been many questions I've been asking myself, and you just maybe give me some hints to think about it more. So just thank you.
No, pleasure, of course. Good. Then we can also end here. The day has been longer for you than for me because you're an hour ahead, in parts at least. And yeah, so until next time.
Yes,
Thank you so much, Markus, for these fantastic and beautiful projects and these inspiring ideas, as usual.
Cool. All the best.